warm welcome to the Reach Conversations in partnership with the Global Indian International School on COVID-19.
So I think the impact of this is quite serious. It's been characterized as a generational crisis. I think we'll be talking about this for 20 or 30 years from now. I hope 20 or 30 years from now, this is still the thing that we're talking about because nothing else has come along. But this is quite possibly going to reshape many of the norms, both on a social and personal level, but also on a global, international level. Secondly, a prioritization on our healthcare services. The data from around the world quite clearly demonstrates that a significant amount of the mortality is associated with a healthcare system that is overwhelmed. So for us here in Singapore, keep that confidence in the people here that they will have access to healthcare. Quick, urgent, subsidized for the appropriate people, and making sure that even for the non-COVID essential services for healthcare, they are maintained. Internally, our second strategy then is aggressive containment, contact tracing, where with every single case, we try to hunt down the contacts, quarantine them, the contacts of the contacts if necessary, as we follow the disease through our society. We believe this effort is still working, and one of the markers of that is that most of the cases that we have seen, the new cases that we have seen over the last few days, have come from overseas. And in fact, that's overwhelmingly the majority. The majority are coming in from overseas. The second biggest group is linked to known clusters, and then a very small number which is unlinked. In fact, usually none. And even those that are unlinked, when we do enough contact tracing, eventually we find a link. So, for all these reasons, we believe that our strategy is working for now.
And so you have a very good grasp on the ground. How do you see this medically evolving in terms of peak, in terms of further, downsides that are likely to come as a result of the current infections? Of course, in Singapore, we have contained it to a large extent, and with all the measures that you explained. But do you see any further downside likely to happen going forward?
I think it's too early to predict with any degree of certainty. Biologically, we know what happens. I mean, the world has been through pandemics, epidemics. We've studied viruses. We know how infections spread in communities. The risks then are, does the virus change in some way? But the evidence suggests so far that it's fairly stable and it hasn't demonstrated a lot of shift and drift in its composition. So I suspect the downsides, the unexpected, are going to be not associated with the biology, but with the economy, or the politics, or the geopolitics. What is the great unknown is how people will respond and be forced to respond.
A lot of other countries are going in the lockdown mode, and they say that that is the best way to fight coronavirus and to contain the spread of the virus. Is Singapore planning any such lockdown in the future?
It is a useful tool if it is used in the right way, at the right time, in the right circumstances. In these other countries, they have the ability to self-sustain their local and domestic supplies and economy. So even if they lock down personal and social gatherings, some of life can go on. In Singapore, we have the advantage that we're small, fairly cohesive, and we can get information out. And there are people in the community that will help to multiply that information, so that when we say we don't want to go for a lockdown, what we want to do is go for social distancing, the outcome is just about where we want to achieve. If you want to go for a lockdown, complete cessation of activities, it is a useful tool if your containment strategy is no longer working. In other words, I have a positive case, and now I have a sense that maybe he infected. Now I had close contact with 50 people, I can only find 10 of them. And the other 40, I don't know where they are, And suddenly I start seeing all these unlinked transmission clusters everywhere. From the science of it, we know that if you closed everything for 2 to 3 incubation cycles, that works out as about 2 to 3 weeks, you can quite effectively reduce the transmission through the community. So would Singapore do that? Possibly. We don't want to rule out any of our strategies. The conditions for doing that are not yet met, which is we have untraceable, uncontrollable community transmission, that we have the certainty that we're not going to have new cases coming in from overseas, and that after we come out, it's not going to start again, right? You want to sort of bring it down to some minimal level and hold it there.
Sheetal, who is in the audience, has asked, do people coming from affected countries going for self-quarantine without a fever, would then the immediate family members also have to self-quarantine?
The quarantine or the stay-at-home notice is basically because you yourself have been directly exposed to risk. If you are exposed to risk but are not yourself the carrier of risk, then the person who's next to you does not have to then take extraordinary steps. So if you are my contact, just as an example, you are found to be positive, you will be in hospital. Because I have had contact with you, I will be under quarantine. But the assumption is I don't carry the risk myself yet. You were the risk. I have been exposed to that risk. So my family member in my home has had no contact with you, is not exposed to the risk. I am the intermediary. During the time that I am in quarantine, as soon as I get a fever, now you have been exposed to risk. If I don't get a fever, you have no risk. But if I get a fever, what I should do is report to hospital immediately.
You had the portfolio of education earlier. As a school, what the school has done is, given the uncertainty of how long the situation will continue, we have launched something called virtual classrooms. Essentially, it is video conferencing available in the classroom. So students who opt to study from home, they stay at home, just sign up. And our entire school, I'm happy to say our entire school is on virtual classrooms. So every student can join their respective classrooms. But as the various MOH graphics, etc. that have come, we've spread in the school, we are sending important updates to parents in addition to what they get. Any specific suggestions you would like to leave for the students from your perspective as to what they should be more careful about?
Firstly, the students seem to be relatively, I don't want to say protected, but they seem to be spared from the worst effects of this virus. It really is something where if you are over the age of 60, you need to take extra care. I'm telling my parents, both of whom are in their 80s, if you can just stay at home for the next 2 weeks, you should do so. After which I'll say, how about another 2 weeks? But they like to get out, they like to go and do things. If they do, I'm telling them to avoid crowds, go to the park by yourself, minimize social contact. The same advice would be useful for students. The same advice would be useful for students. Not because they are at great risk of suffering from this, but because they can have very mild symptoms. They will still have an infection, and then it affects the rest of the family. So they can be a vector for transmission. So even though they don't need to be as fearful for themselves, it's not it is actually a good thing if they have some anxiety on behalf of their family. So for the students, not shaking hands, not having too close social contact. Telling a teenager don't have so close social contact may be challenging, but it's okay. Now is the time to say, please use your phone instead of meeting in real life. As a parent of teenagers, I spent the last few years saying, put your phone down, go and play with your friends. Now I need to say, don't play with your friends, call them on the phone instead, But I think we have to make the point that this is the time, hopefully temporarily, where you need to break these behaviors apart. So it is a balanced strategy that we're doing for our MOE national schools, where you remove the most high-risk activities, where you go to large inter-school sports meets. You don't know which kids are coming and who's shaking hands and who's sweating here. But if you want to do your sports training, groups of 20, groups of 30, groups of 40, you all know each other by name, by sight, by phone number. If one of you becomes sick, I can find every single one of the rest of you and isolate you. That's the kind of strategy that we are going.